Hello and welcome. This is Jennifer McGuire for Scrapbook and Cards Today. In this video, I'm going to show you how to create two cards that were featured in the Creative Cards edition. This Mother's Day card with colored vellum will be at the end of this video, but we're going to first start with this Christmas card that has lots of texture and gold shine. For this card, I'll be using Tim Holtz stencil. This is a poinsettia stencil that I've taped down on some green cardstock. I'm using a tool to apply a thin coating of Ranger texture paste over the stencil. Any kind of stenciling paste would work for this. This one happens to be my favorite, and I'm going to show you how you can add some color and shine to it. So once I've applied an even layer over it and scraped my extra back into the jar and put the lid on, I'm going to remove the stencil. Now keep in mind you want to wash the stencil right away so that paste doesn't dry on it. Now while this is still wet, while the paste is still wet, I am adding some gold glitter embossing powder from Wow. And you want to put on a lot of this because you really want it to stick and cover all of the wet white texture paste. So the more you put on, the better. Now this is going to give it a gold finish and some sparkle because there's glitter in this powder. Now although I added this powder onto the paste when it's wet, I let this dry now. I set this aside for about 10 minutes so that paste can dry under there before I bring the heat gun to it. When I bring the heat gun to it, I'm going to emboss the powder I put on top. Now, if you bring the heat gun to it without letting the paste dry completely first, it causes the paste to kind of bubble up underneath and gives it some texture, which is really cool and fun for other techniques. But here I just wanted to have a smooth finish. So now we have what looks like a heat embossed image, but lots of dimension to it, much more dimension than you would get if you just put a clear sticky ink under that embossing powder. Once this is completely cooled, I'm going to take a Swiffer dusting cloth to just wipe away any of the extra glitter that might be floating around, because remember there was glitter in this embossing powder. And check out that great texture. You can use any type of embossing powders on top of your paste. Gives it lots of shine and dimension. Now for the sentiment, I'm using a stamp set from Simon Says Stamp. I'm actually using 2 sentiments from this set. First, I have Christmas Blessings, and I'm going to stamp this with Versamark ink on some white cardstock. Now, I am going to heat emboss this with regular gold embossing powder this time. The reason I didn't use the glitter embossing powder that I did on the background was I find that for sentiments, it's better to use a regular embossing powder. If it has glitter in it, sometimes it makes it hard to read the sentiments, or it kind of gives a rough edge to super fine detailed images. So that's why I decided to use a regular gold metallic embossing powder here. Now after this, I wanted to stamp another sentiment underneath it, and I'm using a green dye ink that matches the cardstock that I used on the background. And I'm using the grid lines on my background paper to help me make sure that I get those straight. Now I needed a green cardstock that was darker than my background that matched it, but I couldn't find one in my stash. So this is the trick I did. I took some extra that same green cardstock, and I'm using my YG67 green Copic marker just to color the edges to make it a darker green. So now I have a green that matches the background but is a bit darker. You can do this with any of your markers or inks. You can create your own matching paper, and that gives me just enough color to create a matte for our stamp sentiment. Next, I get to assemble the card. So I have a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch white note card, putting adhesive along the back of it. It's just pretty much covering it with adhesive so we can just add everything to it. I did cut a smaller piece off of the background, so you can see I split the background up, and I'm going to adhere one towards the top of the card and the smaller one towards the bottom of the card. I will cover up that white gap with our sentiment piece. So I had created that background to not be wide enough for a card, but I'm kind of faking it by covering it with this sentiment strip. So I'm going to go ahead and add that sentiment strip with lots of foam tape. I think it's really important to add a lot of foam tape along or behind big pieces like this, because I'm going to mail this card, and if I only do small pieces of foam tape behind it, it will get crushed and end up arriving wrinkled when it gets to the recipient. So I put a lot behind there, and I'm going to just adhere this across it. Now I felt like this needed a little something extra, so I die cut a Simon Says Stamp little heart die from white cardstock, and I colored it with a red Copic marker. I could have used red cardstock, but I had white scraps around. Now I'm using my tweezers to kind of decide where I want to add it to my card, And while they're still in my tweezers, that little heart's in my tweezers still, I'm going to add a strong liquid adhesive to the back of it and then use the tweezers to apply it to the card. Sometimes it just needs a little splash of color, and I think this little red heart does the trick here. I did think about putting some other gems on this and such, but I decided it was best to leave it simple. I also wanted a little shine on that tiny little heart, so I'm using glossy accents right on the heart, and this will dry and give it a little bit of dimension and a little bit of shine. So that wraps up this card, showing how to use embossing powder with texture paste for added dimension and shine. Now on the next card, which is completely different, I'll be using embossing powder again, but for a softer look by heat embossing on vellum and adding color to the back of it. So I have some vellum here. This happens to be a heavyweight vellum, but you can use any vellum you may have. And I'm stamping some flowers and leaves repeatedly on it. This is a stamp set from Ellen Hudson. I'm stamping it with Versamark ink, and now I'm going to add some fun glitter-colored embossing powders from Wow. This is a fun technique that you can use any of your unique embossing powders. I really like embossing powders because they last forever and they're very inexpensive, especially these smaller jarred ones. So after I have put on the powder, I let my heat gun get good and hot for about 20 seconds before I bring it to the vellum, and this prevents it from warping. So I'm going to go ahead and heat set them, and I'll be cutting all of these out, so it doesn't matter that I have a little bit of mess on the back of that vellum. Now I've stamped some more flowers again with Versamark ink, and this time I'm using a blue glitter embossing powder for these flowers. And finally, some smaller stamped flowers with yellow embossing powder with glitter in it. For the green leaves, I actually didn't have any green glitter embossing powder, so I just used a regular old green embossing powder, and it worked just fine. So now I wanted to add some color to these. I wanted to color them in. Coloring on vellum can sometimes be tricky because it wants to rub off. So I use my Copic markers, but I color on the back of it. It just gives it a nice muted finish when you look through from the front, but you could color on the front if you wanted to. Now, when I put this down, I want to put as much color down as I can. Here I did this with V55, which is a lighter pink. I ended up going back and making this darker a little bit later. But the nice thing is you can make it as dark or as light as you want. So you can have soft flowers if you prefer. If you don't have Copic markers, you can try Sharpies or any other kind of permanent marker. You could use alcohol inks on the back also. For the leaves, I have YG 17 that I am applying to the back of the vellum once again. And then for the blue flowers, I did BG 17. This is where I decided I wanted my pink to be darker, so I am going on the back again, and this time I'm using RV 17. Now, the reason I don't like to use the Copic on the front is I don't want any of that embossing powder, the embossed images, to ruin my Copic markers. So by doing it on the back, I don't have to worry about it at all. On the yellow, I used YR14, which is like a golden yellow. Keep in mind that this marker would be darker on white paper, but it's lighter when you color on the Copic. So you want to reach for darker colors. I also wanted some of that gold color in the center of my pink flowers, so I'm going right over the pink, and that Copic marker will move that pink away and leave behind that gold color. So this is a super fast way to do coloring. You just scribble it down and it'll look beautiful when you flip it over. Okay, so now I'm just going to go ahead and cut out all of my flowers, and we'll have them ready to add on to our card. For my sentiment, I have a large black die cut circle that I've created, and I have a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch top folding white note card for our card. Now on the sentiment, I'm adding some anti-static powder tool because we're going to white heat emboss on that black cardstock. So I have a stamp set from Clearly Besotted. I really like this set because it has a lot of large script words with tiny little open dots on it, and also smaller sentiments that you can pair with it. So I'm stamping with Versamark, the mother, and then I'll add white heat embossing powder and heat set that. Then I will stamp I Love You underneath it with Versamark once again and add white embossing powder to that. So I like these kind of stamp sets where you can build sentiments up. Now it's time to assemble our cards. So I'm kind of laid them out generally where I want them on the card, putting some adhesive on the back of my black circle here. I decided I didn't want to add dimension behind this. I wanted it to be a flatter card. I'm going to adhere this. Now adhering vellum can sometimes be tricky. There are adhesives out there that say they work with vellum, that you can't see the adhesive through the vellum, but I've never really found one that I was really happy with. So what I do is I hide my adhesive on the back of the vellum. In this case, I'm taking a super strong liquid adhesive and kind of applying it where you probably won't see it. So here I'm putting it around the, right behind the little yellow in the center of the vellum flower. If I put it on the leaf or on the petals, you'd probably see through it. So just that little bit in the center is good enough. A strong adhesive will be great here. This is Ranger Multi Medium, which is a matte finish adhesive that's super strong. So I'm just putting dots of this at the center of these vellum pieces on the back. So here on the leaves, I'm putting it behind where the embossing is. That way you're just hiding your adhesive. There are other adhesive solutions that you can try, but I find that this really works best in making sure you can't see the adhesive through the vellum. After I glued everything down, I felt like there needed to be a black trim on both sides of the card, so I trimmed this down and added it to a black note card. And that is a way that you can use your embossing powders on vellum for a completely different look. I hope you like these card ideas. If you have questions, please visit Scrapbook and Cards today. Thanks for watching.